30 clicks east of RV Gamma, Kilara.
Darman came to the edge of the wood and found himself facing an open field the size of Camino's oceans. It seemed like it anyway. He couldn't see the boundary on either side of him, just straight across where the trees began again. The rows of grain, steel, gray, shining, sighing in the wind, were only waist high. He was 30 clicks east of RV Gamma, desperate to reach it and get some sleep while waiting for the rest of his squad. Following the cover of the hedge, wherever that might take him, would cost him a lot of time. He opted to take the direct route. He removed one of the 3 micro-remotes from his belt and activated it. The tiny viewing device was about the size of a pygmy hummer, small enough to grasp in his palm, and he set it to scout the area for 5 kilometers around him. He didn't like using them unless he absolutely had to. On a planet like this, their shiny metallic coating was hardly geared towards stealth. They also had a tendency to go missing, and because they recorded as well as transmitted, they were one of the last things he wanted to let fall into the enemy's hands. But he wasn't exactly invisible either. He glanced down at his filthy armor, streaked with dried mud, wet green moss, and far, far worse, and knew he was still a big, plastoid alloy industrial object in a gentle, organic environment. He lowered himself onto all fours, adjusting his balance carefully so the pack set squarely down the length of his back. His knee still hurt. Crawling through a field wasn't going to help it. The sooner you get there, the sooner you rest, he thought to himself. The remote soared vertically into the air, playing back a rapidly shrinking view of the field, then the wider landscape of farmland and woods, all within Darman's visor display. There were no buildings, as far as he could see. That didn't necessarily mean the area was deserted. Crawling with his packs generated a lot of heat, but the bodysuit regulated it obediently. The armor system had more pluses than disadvantages. He didn't have to worry about wildlife waiting to bite, sting, poison, infect, or otherwise ruin his entire day. But it was slow going. He had to loop wide if he was going to avoid the little town in Brawny. In fact, the whole day had been one of slow progress, although the only timetable he could latch onto now was that of his comrades, and how long it would take them to make RV Gamma. Then they'd move on if he didn't show by the appointed time. After that, they were off the chart, so to speak. It would be a matter of regrouping and gathering enough intel to take the target. Darman suspected it would take longer than a few days. A lot longer. He had started making notes of what local flora and fauna might be edible, and the positions of springs and watercourses that hadn't shown up on the high-altitude recce. He wondered if the G'dans made decent eating. He reckoned it might not be worth trying. Every so often, he paused to kneel and sip some water from his bottle. His stomach's fantasies were no longer of sizzling Nerf strips, but of sweet, filling, sticky, amber ooze cake. It was a rare treat. His training sergeant had allowed his original squad, to try it, breaking the Caminoan rules on feeding clones carefully balanced nutritional mixes. "You're still just boys," he told them. "Fill your boots." And they had. Good old Cal, he thought. The flavor was still achingly vivid in Darman's mind. He wondered what other normal civilian indulgences he might enjoy if he had access to them. He slapped the thought down hard. His discipline was his self-esteem. He was a professional. He still thought about that ooze cake, though. "Come on, get moving," he said, very tired of the absence of comrades' voices and seeking comfort in his own. He would be his commanding officer, just to stay sharp. "Shift it," he told himself. The remote continued to relay predictable images of bucolic peace, neat patchworks of fields punctuated by the wild, tangled woods, reminders of an unsettled and untamed world. There were no giant harvester droids out yet. At one point, he thought he saw a dark form moving through the field some way to his left, but when he focused on it, there was simply a gap opened by the wind. Then there was a sudden patch of darkness in his visor. Darman stopped dead. The thing had malfunctioned. But the image returned, glowing red and wet, and he realized he was looking into the digestive tract of a living creature. Something had swallowed the remote. A few moments later, a large bird, slowly flapping four wings, sailed overhead and cast an alarming shadow before him. He glanced up. It was probably the same kind that had been sucked into the Narsprayer's Atmos engine.
"I hope it gives you gut-ache, you scumbag,"
he said, and waited for it to dwindle to a black speck before moving on. It took more than half an hour to reach the other side of the field, and he still had 25 clicks to go to the RV point. He decided to go north of the town, although he shouldn't have risked moving by day at all.
"Get there early. Wait for them, just in case they decide I'm dead and they don't hang about,"
he thought. He eased into the bushes, scattering small creatures that he could hear but not see, and considered taking off his packs just for a moment's relief. But he knew that would make it much harder to move when he slotted them back into place again. Exhausted, he fumbled in his belt for a ration cube and chewed, willing the nutrients to hit his bloodstream as fast as they could before he slumped into sleep and didn't get up again. Lights danced in front of his eyes. Fatigue was giving him a heads-up display of its own. The last of the cube dissolved in his mouth.
"Come on, soldier. Hold it up,"
he said. Playing mind games could keep him going. The trick was to remember where the game ended and then snap back to reality. Right then, he decided to let his commander self shout him into action.
"Sir,"
he said, and sprang up from a kneeling position in one move. He tottered slightly when his knees locked out, but he stayed upright and leaned against a tree. He made a mental note that he needed to keep better hydrated. It was so dark in the wood that his night vision kicked in from time to time, superimposing ghostly green images on the trunks and branches. He'd grown used to the range of animal sounds, and the occasional whisper of leaves or snap of twigs blended into the pattern of what his brain was cataloging as NFQ, normal for Kulara. From time to time, a slightly abnormal snap or rustle would make him drop to a squat and turn, rifle ready, but he was clear. He followed the river on his holo chart for part of the way, although it was actually more of a stream. The faint trickle of liquid over rocks was reassuring in a way that the sound of water could be, and after an hour, he came upon a break in the tree canopy that allowed sunlight to filter down on the stream in slanted shafts. Brilliantly colored insects circled and danced above the surface. Darman had never seen anything quite like it. Yes, he knew all about geological formations and what they foretold for soldiers: sources of water, treacherous scree, risk of landslide, caverns to shelter in, high ground for defense, passes to block. Accelerated learning packaged the natural world for him and explained how he could use it to military advantage. But nobody told him it looked so nice. He had no words for it. Like the ooze cake, it was a glimpse of another world that wasn't his.
"Sit down and rest. You're too tired. You'll start making fatal mistakes."
It was weakness talking. He shook his head rapidly to clear it.
"No, Stims. No, not yet."
He had to press on. The insects kept up a constant circuit of the stream like wrecky aircraft, circling, seeking.
"You're hours ahead. Stop. No sleep makes you careless. You can't afford to be careless."
It did sound like common sense. It wasn't the game voice, his imaginary commander giving him orders. It felt deep within him, instinct. And it was right. He was making slower and slower progress, and he had to concentrate on putting one foot in front of the other. He stopped and unclipped one pack, then the other. It was a good enough place to camp. He filled his water bottle and hauled a few half-decayed logs into place to build a defensive sanger, just as Sergeant Cal had taught them. It was only a low defensive circle of rocks, or whatever came to hand, but it made a difference on a battlefield when you couldn't dig in. He sat in the walled hollow he had created, staring at the water. Then he cracked the seal on his helmet and breathed unfiltered air for the first time in many hours. It smelled complex. It wasn't the air conditioning of Tipoca City, and it wasn't the dry, dead air of Geonosis. It was alive. Darman released all the gription panels on his armor and stacked the plates inside the circle of the Sanger, set his helmet to detect movement, and left it on the makeshift wall. Then he peeled off his bodysuit, section by section, and rinsed it in the flowing water. The day was surprisingly warm. He'd had no way of telling what it felt like while he was sealed in the suit, just the ambient environment data on his display. But the water was shockingly cold when he stepped in. He washed quickly, sat in the pool of sunlight to dry off, and then replaced the panels of bodysuit. They'd dried a lot more quickly than he had. Before he let himself nod off, he put his armor back on. There was no sense in getting used to the pleasant sensation of not wearing it. It was drilled so thoroughly into him that he was surprised he'd thought otherwise even for a second. In enemy territory, you slept in full gear, with your blaster ready. He cradled his rifle in his arms, leaning back on his pack, and watched the insects dance on the sunlit water. They were hypnotically beautiful. Their wings were electric blue and bright vermilion, and they wove a figure 8. Then, one by one, they dropped down and floated to the surface, drifting with the current, still wonderfully vivid, but now apparently dead. Darman reacted.
Airborne toxin.
He shut his eyes tight, puffed out the air in his lungs, and snapped his helmet back into place, drawing breath again only when the seal was secure and his filtration mask could take over. But there was no data on his visor to indicate a contaminant. The air was still clean. He leaned out and scooped up a couple of the insects caught in the eddy. One kicked a leg a few times and then was still. When he looked up, there were none left flying. It seemed sad. What bothered him more was that it seemed inexplicable. Curious, he fumbled for an empty ration cube container and dropped the insects into it to consider them later. Then he closed his eyes and tried to doze, rifle ready. But sleep eluded him. His helmet detected movement and woke him every few minutes at the intrusion of a small creature, no threat to him. Once or twice it picked up a Gadan, and he opened his eyes to see glittering points of reflected light staring back at him. The system picked up something larger once, but it wasn't as large as any humanoid in his database, and kept its distance before disappearing.
Get some sleep. You're going to need it, son.
Darman wasn't sure if it was his own voice or that of his imaginary commander. Either way, it was an order he was only too willing to obey.